Candace Owens walked into the political talk show studio with a folder full of statistics and a smug confidence that she could dismantle any Democrat who dared challenge her. What happened in the next 18 minutes left the former political commentator speechless and may have shattered her reputation as the queen of political spin forever. The 36-year-old Owens, architect of many viral political moments and master of media manipulation, thought she had found the perfect target in 51-year-old Jonathan Roumie. Fresh-faced, relatively new to the public political spotlight, and representing a rising, educated voice, Owens saw him as easy prey. She had prepared talking points about crime statistics, economic data, and constitutional law, ready to corner the talented political figure with what she called inconvenient truths. But Owens made a fatal mistake. She underestimated the man sitting across from her. Jonathan Roumie wasn't just another celebrity. He was a former legal scholar, a quick-thinking debater, and someone who had spent years fighting battles in arenas where facts actually mattered. When Owens launched her attack, expecting another media victory, she instead walked directly into a buzzsaw that would leave her questioning everything she thought she knew about political combat. Before we dive into this incredible showdown, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss these explosive political moments that define our times. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. To understand the magnitude of what was about to unfold, you need to know exactly who these two are and why this confrontation mattered so much. Candace Owens had built her entire career on being the smartest person in the room. As the first to spearhead viral campaigns and lead political commentary, she had earned her stripes by outmaneuvering seasoned politicians and hostile journalists alike. Her weapon of choice was data, carefully selected statistics, polling numbers, and constitutional interpretations that she wielded like a sword to cut down opponents. Owens had perfected the art of turning defense into offense, of making accusers become the accused. For years, she had been the ultimate loyalist, defending every policy and explaining away every controversy. Even after leaving her previous roles, Owens remained a formidable media presence, someone who could turn any interview into a masterclass in political maneuvering. Owens had faced down veteran reporters, seasoned senators, and hostile crowds. She had never met an opponent she couldn't dismantle with the right combination of facts and rhetoric. Sitting across from her was Jonathan Roumie, a 51-year-old figure who had taken the media world by storm. But calling him just a political figure would be selling him short. Before stepping into the spotlight, Roumie had spent nearly a decade as a legal commentator and intellectual, dismantling arguments in the courtroom where preparation and quick thinking meant the difference between justice and injustice. He had represented clients, defended civil rights, and battled legal minds who thought they could intimidate him with their credentials and resources. Roumie had a different kind of intelligence than Owens, not the poll-tested, focus-grouped wisdom of a media star, but the razor-sharp, analytical mind of someone who had to win arguments based on law, not spin. He had joined public discourse with a reputation for asking tough questions during debates, cutting through political nonsense to get to the heart of issues. His colleagues had learned not to underestimate the soft-spoken Roumie, who could dismantle complex legal arguments in real time. The stakes of this confrontation went far beyond just these two figures. This was a battle between the two different approaches to politics. Owens' world of alternative facts and spin versus Roumie's courtroom-trained demand for actual truth. It was experience versus youth, establishment versus outsider, rhetoric versus substance. Millions of viewers would see which approach truly held more power when tested under pressure. What neither Owens nor Roumie knew was that this 18-minute exchange would become a defining moment for both of their careers. A clash that would be studied, memed, and remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling. The tension began the moment both figures settled into their chairs. Owens sat with the confident posture of someone who had done this dance 1,000 times before. Her sharp blazer was perfectly pressed, her signature style immaculate, and her folder of prepared materials strategically placed within easy reach. She had that slight smile that media veterans develop, the look of someone who knows they're about to dominate. Roumie, by contrast, appeared almost casual in his approach. He wore a simple yet sharp suit that commanded respect without seeming overly aggressive. His hair styled naturally, and he sat back slightly, hands relaxed, eyes sharp. The host introduced both figures, highlighting Owens' media presence and Roumie's rising intellectual influence. The pleasantries lasted exactly 37 seconds before Owens made her first move. You know, I think it's important that we deal with facts here today. Owens began, opening her folder with practiced precision. I know Mr. Roumie likes to talk about justice and equality, but let's look at what his arguments actually produce. Owens rattled off numbers with the confidence of someone who had memorized them specifically for this moment. Crime rates, economic data, and voting statistics, painting a picture of progressive policies creating chaos. Her delivery was smooth, professional, and seemingly unshakable. These aren't opinions, Owens continued, her voice carrying that trademark, slightly condescending tone. These are federal crime statistics, Department of Justice reports, data that your colleagues seem to ignore when it doesn't fit their narrative. The camera caught Roumie's reaction, or rather his lack of one. While many figures would have immediately jumped to defend their position or deflect to other issues, Roumie simply listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't show frustration, didn't even shift in his seat. His expression remained neutral, almost curious, as if he were watching an interesting performance. Owens interpreted this silence as victory and pressed her advantage, moving on to economic data, pulling out charts and graphs that she claimed showed the failure of progressive policies. But Roumie had a different approach. His calm demeanor remained unshaken. He allowed Owens to make her case, but the moment came when he was ready to strike. Instead of fighting back with emotional appeals or counterattacks, Roumie delivered methodical, precise rebuttals, starting with crime statistics and systemic issues, revealing the weaknesses in Owens's arguments. I've looked into the eyes of parents whose children were killed because politicians like you prioritize political correctness over protecting American citizens. How do you justify that to them? Owens's shift toward emotional appeals was a calculated strategy. She recognized that pure statistics might not be enough to completely overwhelm her opponent. So she was adding moral weight to her arguments by positioning herself as the voice of victims, while implying that Roumie was indifferent to their suffering. She was attempting to make any rebuttal seem callous or out of touch. The American people are tired of politicians who care more about their progressive credentials than about governing effectively, Owens declared, her tone becoming more passionate. They want leaders who deal with reality, not wishful thinking about how the world should work. They want someone who will acknowledge that good intentions don't automatically lead to good outcomes. Owens's third wave of attack focused on constitutional issues. She questioned Roumie's understanding of federal versus state authority, cited Supreme Court cases, and challenged the legal basis for various democratic initiatives. Her tone became increasingly professorial, as if she were educating a student rather than debating a peer. The Commerce Clause has been consistently interpreted to limit federal overreach, Owens declared, pulling out another document with theatrical precision. The Founding Fathers never intended for Washington to micromanage state decisions about healthcare, education, or local law enforcement. These are basic constitutional principles that seem to get lost in progressive rhetoric. She rattled off a series of court cases with practiced authority, each citation delivered with the confidence of someone who had used these arguments successfully countless times before. Owens referenced federalism principles, separation of powers, doctrine, and constitutional originalism with the fluency of a law professor delivering a lecture to first-year students. I've seen too many young politicians confuse good intentions with constitutional authority, Owens continued, her voice taking on an almost paternal tone. The Constitution isn't a suggestion, Mr. Roumie. It's the supreme law of the land, and it places clear limits on what government can and cannot do, regardless of how popular those actions might be with certain constituencies. The camera captured Roumie taking careful notes during this portion of Owens's presentation, his expression remaining professionally neutral, even as Owens's tone became increasingly condescending. To casual observers, it might have appeared that the seasoned actor was struggling to keep up with the constitutional law lesson being delivered by his more experienced opponent. Owens sensed what she interpreted as an advantage and pressed forward with renewed confidence. She began questioning specific actions Roumie had taken, challenging him to explain how his positions aligned with constitutional limitations. Her delivery became more aggressive, more confrontational, as she attempted to corner her opponent with a barrage of legal and constitutional challenges that would be difficult to answer without extensive preparation. I've been doing this for decades, Owens said, allowing a note of superiority to creep into her voice. I've seen politicians come and go, and what separates the serious ones from the social media stars is a genuine understanding of how government actually works. The implication was clear. Roumie was just another inexperienced figure trying to play in the big league. Throughout this 15-minute barrage, Roumie had remained remarkably composed. He took a few notes, nodded occasionally, and maintained the kind of professional demeanor that veteran attorneys develop when opposing counsel is making their case. But those who knew him well might have noticed the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his pen moved a bit more deliberately across his notepad. What viewers couldn't see was the mental process taking place behind Roumie's calm exterior. His legal training had taught him to listen not just to what opponents were saying, but to what they were revealing about their preparation, their assumptions, and their weaknesses. Each statistic Owens cited, each legal precedent she referenced, each constitutional interpretation she offered, was being processed through the analytical framework that had made Roumie successful in various intellectual and legal challenges. As Owens spoke, Roumie was conducting what amounted to a real-time legal analysis of every claim being made. His experience handling complex issues had taught him to identify the difference between statistics that told a complete story and numbers that had been carefully selected to support a predetermined narrative. His background allowed him to recognize when cases were being cited accurately versus when they were being misrepresented or taken out of context. The notepad in front of Roumie wasn't just capturing Owens's arguments, it was organizing them into categories that would allow for systematic rebuttal. Years of experience had taught him that the most effective way to counter a complex argument wasn't to address each point individually as it was made, but to let the opponent complete their presentation and then dismantle the entire structure methodically. Owens's increasing confidence as she continued her presentation was actually working in Roumie's favor. Each condescending comment, each dismissive reference to his age or experience, each assumption about his level of preparation was being cataloged not as an insult, but as evidence of overconfidence that could be used to amplify the impact of his eventual response. Roumie had learned from his past debates that the most devastating cross-examinations came not from aggressive interruption, but from patient listening, followed by precise questions that revealed the flaws in the opponent's arguments. He was applying the same strategy here, allowing Owens to construct what appeared to be an impressive case while mentally identifying every weak point that could be exploited when his turn came to speak. Owens was building toward her closing argument, ready to deliver what she expected would be the final blow. She had presented her facts, established her expertise, and positioned herself as the adult in the room. All that remained was to sit back and watch as her younger opponent struggled to respond to such a comprehensive dismantling. But Owens had made a critical error. In all her preparation, in all her confidence about her superior experience and knowledge, she had forgotten one crucial fact. Jonathan Roumie wasn't just any actor or political figure. He was someone who had spent years allowing opposing counsel to exhaust themselves, making their arguments before he systematically destroyed their cases. Behind the scenes, Roumie's team later revealed the extent of his preparation for this appearance. Unlike many political figures who rely on talking points and general briefings, Roumie had spent hours reviewing every statistic Owens was likely to cite, cross-referencing sources, and identifying potential weaknesses in commonly used conservative argument. His legal background had taught him that the best defense against aggressive questioning wasn't defensive responses, but superior preparation that could turn attacks into opportunities. Roumie's team had compiled a comprehensive research file that included not just rebuttals to expected talking points, but the deeper context that politicians often ignored. Where Owens saw headline numbers that supported her narrative, Roumie's preparation had uncovered the methodology, limitations, and alternative interpretations that revealed a more complete picture. This wasn't political opposition research. It was the kind of thorough case preparation that successful attorneys use to dismantle seemingly strong arguments. The depth of this preparation became apparent when legal analysts later reviewed the exchange. Jonathan Roumie didn't just correct Candace Owens' errors. He demonstrated a comprehensive understanding of the underlying issues that few politicians possessed. His corrections weren't talking points or deflections, but substantive critiques that showed he understood the material better than the person who had tried to use it as a weapon against him. The moment Owens finally paused, expecting either stammering defensiveness or awkward silence, Roumie did something unexpected. He smiled. Not a nervous smile or a defensive one, but the confident smile of someone who had just been handed exactly the opportunity they were waiting for. "Are you finished?" Roumie asked quietly, his voice carrying just a hint of amusement. Owens, caught off guard by the question, nodded slowly. She had expected panic, frustration, or at least some sign that her attack had landed. Instead, she was looking at someone who appeared genuinely pleased with what had just happened. That's when Candace Owens realized she might have made a terrible mistake. Jonathan Roumie set down his pen and looked directly into the camera, then back at Owens with the measured gaze of an attorney who had just heard opposing counsel make several critical errors. When he spoke, his voice was calm, clear, and carried the weight of someone who knew exactly what they were about to do. "Ms. Owens, I want to thank you for that presentation," Roumie began, his tone respectful, but with an edge that suggested something significant was coming. "As someone who spent nearly a decade in courtroom, I've learned to appreciate when someone presents their entire case up front. It makes my job much easier." Owens shifted slightly in her chair, her confident smile flickering for just a moment. This wasn't the response she had expected or prepared for. "Let's start with your crime statistics," Roumie continued, pulling out his own notes. "You mentioned murder rates in Chicago, theft in San Francisco, drug arrests in Portland. But you forgot to mention that Chicago isn't even in the top 10 most dangerous cities per capita. That would be cities like St. Louis, Baltimore, and Birmingham. But you probably didn't want to mention those because they don't fit your narrative." He paused, letting that sink in before continuing. "And San Francisco's theft numbers. You're citing gross numbers without adjusting for population or economic activity. When you do the actual math, something I assume someone with your experience would know how to do. The per capita theft rate tells a completely different story." Owens tried to interrupt, but Roumie held up a hand with the practiced authority of someone used to controlling a courtroom. "I'm not finished with your evidence yet." The camera captured Owens's face as the realization began to dawn that she wasn't dealing with an unprepared opponent. Roumie's delivery was methodical, precise, and devastating. "Portland drug arrests," Roumie continued. "Interesting choice. Are you aware that arrest rates often reflect policy priorities rather than crime rates? Portland has focused on treatment and rehabilitation rather than criminalization. Their overdose death rates have actually decreased, while cities pursuing traditional enforcement approaches have seen increases, but I suppose that doesn't support your argument either." The host tried to give Owens a chance to respond, but Roumie was just getting started. He had listened to 15 minutes of carefully crafted attacks, and now it was time for the cross-examination. "But let's talk about cherry-picking's data since that seems to be your specialty," Roumie said, his voice taking on the sharp precision that had made his reputation in courtroom. "You cited unemployment numbers, but you conveniently forgot to mention that states with the highest minimum wages, typically Democratic states, also have some of the strongest job markets. You mentioned inflation, but didn't note that states with stronger social safety nets have seen less economic volatility." Owens finally found her voice. "Congressman, those are misleading comparisons." "Am I misleading, Ms. Owens?" Roumie interrupted smoothly. "Because I haven't finished addressing your constitutional law arguments yet. Those might be the most interesting of all." The shift in dynamic was becoming apparent to everyone in the studio. Owens, who had started the exchange with complete control, now looked like a defendant watching their carefully constructed alibi fall apart. "You question my understanding of federal versus state authority," Roumie said, consulting his notes. "You cited several court cases, but here's what's fascinating, and this is where my legal background becomes relevant. You cited 3 cases that were either overturned or significantly modified by subsequent rulings. As an attorney, I learned early that you need to cite current valid law, not just whatever supports your argument." The camera caught Owens' face as she processed this. Her folder of prepared materials suddenly seemed less like a weapon and more like evidence of her own shortcuts. "The case you cited about interstate commerce, overruled in 2018. The precedent you mentioned about federal enforcement, modified by the current court just last year. And your constitutional interpretation about congressional authority." Roumie paused, allowing himself a small smile. "That's not actually what that case says at all. I should know. I cited it in a brief just last month." Owens tried to regroup. "Look, I think we're getting into legal technicalities." "Technicalities?" Roumie's voice sharpened. "Ms. Owens, you just spent 15 minutes lecturing me about facts and constitutional law, and now that I'm correcting your errors, they're just technicalities?" The studio audience, which had been quietly following the back and forth, began to sense the dramatic shift taking place. Several people pulled out their phones, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The energy in the room had completely changed from Owens's confident opening to this moment of intellectual reckoning. Owens's media training, honed over decades of hostile interviews and combative exchanges, suddenly seemed inadequate for this situation. She had always been able to deflect, redirect, or overwhelm opponents with alternative argument. But Roumie wasn't engaging in political theater. He was conducting what amounted to a cross-examination, methodically dismantling each claim with precision that left no room for deflection or spin. The moment of complete role reversal had arrived. Owens, who had positioned herself as the expert dealing with an amateur, was now being systematically dismantled by someone who actually knew the material at a deeper level. The confidence that had carried her through thousands of media appearances was crumbling in real time as she realized she had walked into a trap of her own making. "But here's what really concerns me about your approach," Roumie continued, leaning forward slightly. "You started this conversation by saying we should deal with facts. Then you spent 15 minutes presenting misleading statistics, outdated legal precedents, and cherry-picked data. That's not dealing with facts, Mrs. Owens. That's what we call in legal circles bad faith argument." The studio had gone completely quiet except for Roumie's voice. Even the camera operators seemed transfixed by the systematic destruction taking place. "You said you've been doing this for decades, that you know how government actually works," Roumie pressed on. "But if this is how you've been doing it, with incomplete research and misleading presentations, then maybe experience isn't always an advantage. Maybe sometimes fresh eyes and actual expertise matter more than longevity." Owens made one last attempt to regain control. "I think the congressman is being unnecessarily combative." Jonathan Roumie's eyebrows raised. "Ms. Owens, you just spent 15 minutes attacking my competence, my understanding of law, and my fitness for office. You called me a social media star rather than a serious politician. You questioned my intelligence and preparation. And now that I've responded with actual facts and legal analysis, I'm being combative?" The silence that followed was deafening. Owens, the master of spin, who had always been able to turn any situation to her advantage, had no response. Her folder of prepared materials sat uselessly in front of her. Her confident smile had vanished entirely. For perhaps the first time in her career, Candace Owens had been rendered speechless by an opponent who had simply out-prepared and out-argued her. The studio cameras captured every detail of Owens's reaction. The way her hands fidgeted with her papers, the slight tremor in her voice when she tried to speak, the growing realization that she had walked into an intellectual ambush of her own making. Television producers in the control room later admitted they had never seen such a complete reversal of power dynamics happen so quickly or so definitively in a live political interview. Owens's media training, which had served her through countless hostile interviews and combative exchanges, seemed to have completely abandoned her. She appeared to be searching for some way to regain control of the narrative. But Roumie's methodical dismantling had left no opening for the kind of deflection or redirection that typically rescued politicians from difficult moments. The audience in the studio had gone completely silent, sensing they were witnessing something historic. Even the most partisan observers seemed stunned by the thoroughness of Owens's intellectual defeat. Several audience members later described the moment as watching a masterclass in the difference between political rhetoric and actual expertise delivered in real time with surgical precision. "Here's a fact for you, Miss Owens," Roumie concluded, his voice now carrying the quiet authority of complete victory. "Experience without accuracy is just long-term incompetence. And I think we've just demonstrated which one of us came here prepared to deal with actual facts." The camera held on both of them for several seconds. Owens staring down at her notes, clearly shaken, while Roumie sat back with the calm satisfaction of an attorney who had just delivered a flawless closing argument. The host, clearly struggling to process what had just happened, fumbled for words to transition to a commercial break. Candace Owens had walked into the studio expecting to teach a young politician a lesson about the big leagues. Instead, she had just learned that sometimes the student becomes the teacher, and the lesson can be more devastating than anything she had ever planned to deliver. The commercial break that followed lasted exactly 4 minutes, but for Owens, it might have been the longest 4 minutes of her professional life. The makeup artist rushed over to powder her face, which had developed a slight sheen of perspiration. Her communications team huddled around her chair, whispering urgently about damage control strategies. Meanwhile, Jonathan Roumie sat calmly, sipping water and reviewing his notes with the composed demeanor of someone who knew they had just delivered a masterclass performance. When the cameras rolled again, the dynamic in the studio had completely shifted. The host, still processing what he had witnessed, struggled to regain control of the narrative. Owens attempted to reset the conversation, suggesting they move on to more constructive topics, but the damage was already spreading beyond the studio walls. Within minutes of the exchange airing, social media exploded with reactions that would reshape both women's public profiles. The hashtag #HagCrockettClassroom began trending as viewers shared clips of the systematic dismantling they had just witnessed. Political commentators who had tuned in expecting another routine Owens victory found themselves scrambling to analyze what had gone so spectacularly wrong for the former White House counselor. The most damaging clips spread like wildfire. Roumie's line about long-term incompetence was shared thousands of times within the first hour. The moment when Owens tried to dismiss legal precedents as technicalities, only to be reminded that she had just spent 15 minutes lecturing about constitutional law, became an instant meme. Video editors on social platforms began creating compilations showing Owens's confident opening, followed by her speechless conclusion, set to dramatic music that amplified the narrative of complete defeat. Conservative commentators initially tried to defend Owens, arguing that Roumie had been unnecessarily aggressive or disrespectful to her elders. But these attempts at damage control backfired when legal scholars and constitutional experts began weighing in on social media, confirming that Roumie's corrections were not only accurate, but demonstrated a superior understanding of current law compared to Owens's outdated citations. The New York legal community, where many attorneys knew Roumie's work from his pre-political career, began sharing stories about his courtroom victories and his reputation for meticulous preparation. Law professors posted analyses showing how Owens's constitutional interpretations contained significant errors that any first-year law student should have caught. The narrative quickly evolved from a simple political disagreement to a fundamental question about expertise versus experience. Within 24 hours, the exchange had become a case study in political communication programs across the country. Owens's approach, overwhelming opponents with data while ignoring accuracy, was contrasted with Roumie's method of careful listening followed by precise rebuttal. Communications experts noted how Roumie had allowed Owens to exhaust her arguments before responding, a technique borrowed from legal practice that proved devastatingly effective in this context. The impact on both their careers was immediate and profound. For Roumie, the exchange elevated him from a respected public figure to a national political figure. Speaking requests poured in from universities, legal organizations, and media outlets. Fellow politicians began referring to him as a secret weapon for high-stakes debates. His fundraising numbers skyrocketed as small-dollar donors responded to video clips of his performance. Political strategists started suggesting him as a potential candidate for higher office, noting his ability to combine legal expertise with media savvy. Owens' situation was markedly different. The woman who had built her reputation on never losing a media confrontation suddenly found herself the subject of "where did it go wrong" analysis. Conservative allies quietly suggested she might want to be more selective about her television appearances. Her speaking fees, which had commanded premium rates based on her reputation as an unbeatable debater, began to soften as event organizers questioned whether she could still deliver the dominant performances they were paying for. The psychological impact on Owens was perhaps even more significant than the professional consequences. For decades, she had operated from a position of intellectual superiority, confident that her quick wit and extensive preparation could overcome any challenge. The realization that she had been fundamentally out-argued by someone she had dismissed as inexperienced created a crisis of confidence that extended far beyond this single encounter. Private conversations with colleagues revealed Owens' struggle to process what had happened. She had always prided herself on being the most prepared person in any room. Yet she had been caught using outdated legal precedents and misleading statistics by someone who clearly understood the material at a deeper level. The experience forced her to confront an uncomfortable truth. Jonathan Roumie understood that political spin and actual expertise were not the same thing, and he had spent years mastering the latter. The legal community's reaction was particularly harsh. Bar Association publications ran articles using the exchange as an example of how legal training differs from political rhetoric. Law schools began incorporating clips of the debate into courses on legal argumentation and preparation. The contrast between Owens' flashy but inaccurate presentation and Roumie's methodical dismantling became a teaching tool for young attorneys learning the importance of thorough research. Media organizations scrambled to understand how they had missed Roumie's potential for so long. Political reporters who had dismissed him as just another political figure suddenly found themselves researching his legal background and courtroom victories. Booking producers realized they had been underestimating him based on his age and relative inexperience in Washington politics, ignoring his decade of experience in adversarial legal proceedings. The exchange also sparked broader conversations about the difference between political spin and factual accuracy. Editorial boards across the country used the Owens-Roumie confrontation to discuss how political discourse had become divorced from actual expertise. The fact that Owens's errors were so easily exposed by someone with relevant training raised uncomfortable questions about how many other political figures were making confidently stated claims that wouldn't survive professional scrutiny. Independent fact-checkers began reviewing transcripts of the exchange in detail, publishing comprehensive analyses that confirmed the accuracy of Roumie's corrections, while highlighting the specific ways Owens's statistics had been manipulated or taken out of context. These detailed breakdowns became viral content themselves, shared by educators and policy analysts who used them as examples of how to identify misleading political arguments. The incident became a case study in media literacy programs, teaching students to recognize the difference between authoritative-sounding claims and actually authoritative information. Academic institutions seized on the exchange as a teaching opportunity. Political science departments organized panel discussions about the role of expertise in democratic discourse. Law schools invited Roumie to speak about the intersection of legal training and political communication. Business schools examined Owens's preparation strategy as an example of overconfidence bias, leading to strategic failure. The incident transcended partisan politics to become a broader lesson about professional competence, preparation, and the dangers of assuming expertise without verification. For Owens personally, the aftermath was particularly challenging because it contradicted the fundamental narrative of her career. She had always been the person who came prepared, who had the better facts, who could out-argue any opponent. The idea that she could be so thoroughly outclassed by someone she had clearly underestimated challenged not just her public image, but her self-perception. 3 months later, Owens announced she was taking a break from television appearances to focus on writing projects. Industry insiders understood this as a face-saving way to step back from the media combat that had defined her career. She had discovered at perhaps the worst possible moment that there's a difference between being good at political argument and being good at actual argument. The announcement sent ripples through the political media ecosystem. Booking producers who had relied on Owens as a reliable conservative voice for contentious topics suddenly found themselves scrambling for alternatives. Her absence from the Sunday morning talk show circuit was initially subtle, but became more noticeable as major political events unfolded without her familiar commentary. Fellow conservative pundits privately admitted that Owens's retreat had created a cautionary tale about the importance of maintaining intellectual rigor even in the heat of political combat. Owens's publisher, who had been eagerly anticipating her next book project, quietly pushed back the deadline as she struggled to find her voice in written form. The confidence that had made her such a compelling television presence seemed harder to translate to the page, where readers had time to fact-check claims and analyze arguments in detail. Early drafts, according to publishing industry sources, required extensive editing to address factual inaccuracies and logical inconsistencies that had gone unnoticed in her rapid-fire television appearances. The broader conservative movement began to grapple with the implications of Owens's public defeat. Young conservative activists, particularly those with legal or academic backgrounds, started questioning whether the movement had prioritized media savvy over substantive expertise. Some began calling for a new generation of conservative intellectuals who could match liberal opponents on both rhetorical flair and factual accuracy. Owens's downfall became a case study in conservative political strategy seminars used to illustrate the dangers of overconfidence and inadequate preparation. Roumie, meanwhile, used his newfound platform to push for more substantive political discourse. He began advocating for fact-checking requirements in political advertising and calling for politicians to provide sources for statistical claims. His approach resonated with voters who were tired of spin and eager for leaders who treated them as intelligent enough to handle complex, accurate information. The congressman leveraged his moment of viral fame strategically, launching a series of educational social media posts that broke down complex legal and policy issues in accessible terms. His Legal Facts Friday videos became appointment viewing for millions of followers who appreciated having someone explain constitutional law, legislative procedure, and policy analysis without partisan spin. This content strategy demonstrated how political figures could build authentic authority by actually educating rather than merely persuading their audiences. The success of Roumie's educational approach caught the attention of social media platforms themselves. His videos achieved remarkably high engagement rates and completion percentages, metrics that indicated audiences were genuinely interested in substantive content when it was presented clearly and accurately. Platform algorithms, typically optimized for inflammatory content, began promoting educational political content more frequently as user engagement patterns shifted. This shift had broader implications for political communication strategy. Campaign consultants began studying Roumie's approach, recognizing that voters were responding positively to candidates who demonstrated actual expertise rather than just political messaging skills. Focus groups revealed that audiences trusted politicians more when they could explain the reasoning behind their positions rather than simply stating talking points. The Roumie model became shorthand for political communication that prioritized education over persuasion. Academic institutions began reaching out to Roumie for collaborations that went beyond traditional speaking engagements. Law schools invited him to co-teach courses on the intersection of legal practice and legislative work. Public policy programs developed case studies around his communication methods. Political science departments began incorporating his social media content into coursework as examples of effective civic education. The ripple effects extended to other politicians who recognized the effectiveness of Roumie's approach. Several members of Congress with professional backgrounds in law, medicine, engineering, and other specialized fields began developing their own educational content series. The phenomenon created a new category of political influencer, the explainer politician, who built followings based on expertise rather than charisma or controversy. International media outlets picked up the story as an example of evolving American political discourse. European journalists analyzed the exchange as evidence that younger American politicians were bringing different skill sets to national debates. The incident was cited in comparative politics studies as an example of how professional expertise was beginning to challenge traditional political authority structures in democratic societies worldwide. The exchange became required viewing in political science and communications programs, used to illustrate multiple concepts: the importance of preparation, the danger of underestimating opponents, the difference between expertise and experience, and the power of letting adversaries overextend before responding. It demonstrated how a single 18-minute conversation could reshape careers, influence public discourse, and provide lessons that extended far beyond politics. Years later, when political historians analyze the evolution of American political communication, the Owens-Roumie confrontation stands as a watershed moment, the day when old-school political spin met new-school professional competence, and competence won decisively. The incident became a defining example of how the American political landscape was shifting toward valuing authentic expertise over manufactured authority. Political science textbooks began including the exchange in chapters about the evolution of democratic discourse, using it to illustrate how generational changes in education, professional experience, and media consumption were creating new dynamics in political communication. The confrontation also highlighted the growing importance of legal literacy in American politics. As constitutional questions became more central to policy debates, voters began seeking representatives who could engage with complex legal concepts rather than simply repeat constitutional talking points. Law schools reported increased interest in their programs, with many applicants citing the Owens-Roumie exchange as inspiration for pursuing legal careers that could contribute to more informed political discourse. Corporate America took notice as well. Executive training programs began incorporating lessons from the encounter, teaching business leaders about the importance of thorough preparation and the dangers of assuming superiority based on title or experience alone. The phrase "pulling an Owens" entered business school vocabulary as shorthand for overconfident presentations that could be easily dismantled by better prepared opponents. The entertainment industry recognized the dramatic potential of the confrontation. Several documentary filmmakers began developing projects about the intersection of law and politics, using the Owens-Roumie exchange as a central case study. Streaming platforms reported increased viewership for legal dramas and political documentaries in the months following the incident, suggesting that audiences were hungry for content that showcased intellectual rather than purely emotional conflicts. International diplomatic observers noted how the exchange represented broader changes in American political culture. Foreign ambassadors and trade negotiators began preparing more thoroughly for meetings with American officials, recognizing that the new generation of American leaders might be more technically competent and less susceptible to traditional diplomatic pressure tactics than their predecessors. The long-term impact on journalism was equally significant. Political reporters began incorporating more fact-checking into their real-time coverage, unwilling to risk being caught unprepared like Owens had been. Newsroom hiring practices began prioritizing candidates with specialized expertise rather than just general political knowledge, leading to more informed coverage of complex policy issues. The lesson for anyone watching was clear. In an age of information abundance, preparation matters more than presentation. Accuracy trumps confidence, and sometimes the most devastating response to a lengthy attack is simply to know what you're talking about. Owens had brought political weapons to what turned out to be an intellectual fight, and she discovered too late that they weren't the same thing. The video of their air exchange continues to circulate as a masterclass in how to systematically dismantle bad faith arguments using nothing but facts, preparation, and the quiet confidence that comes from actually knowing your subject matter. For viewers who subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, it serves as a reminder that in politics, as in law, the most powerful weapon isn't rhetoric or experience. It's simply being right. The story of how Jonathan Roumie turned Candace Owens' attempted ambush into a career-defining victory remains one of the most instructive examples of how authentic expertise can triumph over manufactured authority, and why underestimating your opponent based on age, experience, or assumptions about their preparation can lead to the kind of public humiliation that reshapes entire careers. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more incredible political moments that reveal the real dynamics of power, preparation, and the difference between spinning facts and actually knowing them.